Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Coffee with Craig, where we talk about all things firearms policy, politics, culture, media, you name it. We're talking about it right here on Coffee with Craig. So please take a moment, like and share the program so that your friends can join us, whether you're watching us on YouTube or Facebook, or you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Google Podcasts. Let your friends know this is the place to talk about guns and gun policy and the fight for our right to keep and bear arms. Also, please take a moment and go to fpcgear.com. That's fpcgear.com. It is a cool place where you can buy all sorts of cool t-shirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, and know that every dollar that you spend there's going to go right back into the fight for a right to keep and bear arms. You can look good. You can support the Second Amendment. You can look good doing it. I can't think of a better way to spend your money on fashion than fpcgear.com. Please remember, go there and tell your friends. All right, I got to apologize to you guys. I apologize for taking so long to get back. Last week was SHOT, and for anyone who goes to SHOT, you kind of know it's kind of a work hard, play hard mentality. And you're there in Vegas all week, and you're there working from morning till quitting time, and then you're going out, you're having a good time with all of your friends. You're going out, because for many times these are people that you're only going to see once, maybe twice a year. So it's a good chance to kind of hang out, talk with people, see Vegas and all that. So needless to say, I got back, and I was cool when I got back. You guys could probably tell that my voice was a little raspy and whatnot. But let's just say that a bug got me. And needless to say, I had to take a few days off and get some rest. So thank you guys for being patient. But as you can see, we are back on the air, and we got some stuff to talk about. Matter of fact, I got so many things I want to talk about. It was hard for me to pick what I was going to talk about today. But today we're going to talk about, one of the biggest topics that I think the anti-gun people like to talk about is the idea of background checks, right? Chris Murphy, who is a senator who is just this big, probably one of the most vocal anti-gun senators, other than maybe Dianne Feinstein. But he has a bill that he's just introduced that deals with the issue of background checks. And so he decided that he was going to do a video talking about why background checks are so important and why everybody should support background checks. In fact, he kind of even lays out exactly, what they are. He lays out what they are, how good they are, and why everybody should be behind them, and kind of why he believes his bill will be helpful. And so I want to take a little bit of time and debunk some of the things that Mr. Murphy had to say, because needless to say, while it's interesting, let's just put it this way: he's a little short on the truth. So let's debunk a little bit of it. Let's say clip number 1 from his video, and we'll talk a little bit about it.
You go buy a gun from a federally licensed dealer in person or online, your name is run through the background check system to make sure that you're not prohibited from owning a firearm. That check normally takes about 90 seconds. Convicted felons, domestic abusers, and people who are severely mentally ill aren't allowed to buy a gun.
Okay, so let's break that down just a little bit, shall we? So first of all, one of the first myths is that background checks are, they're simple, they're common sense. Right? And that's how they always portray it. Whenever you hear someone say that something is common sense, it probably isn't. It's their way of masking the idea that we don't have to look any deeper into any of these issues because, it just makes common sense. Well, the problem is that in particular to people who really haven't read the details, and then we always say the devil's in the details when it comes to any legislation, especially firearms legislation. But if you haven't read the details, then you don't know exactly what it is when they say it's simple. And I'll give you a great example. So first of all, it depends on, like I said, it depends on how the law is written. There are some background check laws. And it's one thing if you're talking about a background check law where it's like you go, you give them your ID, you do a fingerprint, they check you out, they say, okay, this person is not prohibited from owning a firearm. If that is what you're talking about in terms of a background check, most people, other than the fact that it's annoying, wouldn't be opposed to that. Or at least a lot of people who are opposed to background checks wouldn't be opposed to that. Because what you're doing is you're checking the person to make sure that the person is not prohibited from owning a firearm. That's one thing. But here's the problem. Many background check laws aren't written that way. Many background check laws are actually written in such a way that it's a roundabout registration of firearms. Because otherwise, why do they need the serial number and the make and the model of your firearm? Where does that information go? If not, to go into a database so that they know who bought that firearm and so that they know where you transferred that firearm. So now we've gone from a background check, make sure that you are someone who's not prohibited from owning firearms legally, to actually registering and tying a firearm to the person who owns it. Now, some people are saying, well, why should that matter? Well, because as soon as the government decides that they don't want you to own something anymore, they now have a list of what you own. They know who owns the guns, who owns the rifles or the long guns, who owns the semi-automatic rifles. They now know. So when the time comes for them to confiscate them, they know exactly whose door to go knocking on. So yeah, it is not that simple. And oh, by the way, this is the other interesting thing. So he said that the average background check takes about 90 seconds. And that's not too far from what we know to be the truth. So why is it that you have to do why is it that you have to have a waiting period? Well, they say, well, there's some things that we need to check. Well, there's some things that come up on the background check that, like, for example, you may have been arrested for something, but it doesn't say what exactly happened. There may have been a temporary restraining order out there, but they don't know how it was adjudicated. So sometimes it takes longer than that. But by the way, even those are few and far in between, right? So why do you need an extended waiting period? Why do you need a waiting period? And that's what many states are pushing for. For example, California has a 10-day waiting period. And then there's even, once again, even beyond that, you have Oregon is looking for a 14-day waiting period. 14-day waiting period for what? Oh, by the way, they say, well, you need a cooling off period. Well, okay, so what if you already own guns? We actually have a lawsuit on that. So if you already own guns, why do you need a cooling off period if I already own a firearm? If I were going to do something, I'd do it with the firearm that I already owned. Why do I need a cooling off period? See, these are, once again, the sorts of things that they don't want to tell you. They don't want to think about. They also don't want to tell you that in many cases, a lot of states, in particular when it comes to mental illness, a lot of states, their HIPAA laws do not allow them to share their information with the National Background Check, with NICS. So in many cases, there could be some instances where someone mentally is not legally should not have a firearm, but those states don't report. By the way, those generally tend to be the more liberal states, just so you know. So it's not as simple. It's not as simple a thing as they would have you to believe. Let's go on to lie number 2.
The good news is background checks work. Since the Brady Law was enacted, over 300 million background checks have taken place, and over 3 million sales to criminals and people who are seriously mentally ill were stopped by a background check. That's 3 million potentially dangerous people who never got their hands on a gun. Okay, so they want to say, once again, that quote-unquote background checks work. But here's the thing we know. And I believe it's somewhere around 94, 95. But I don't remember exactly what the number is. But I know that it's over 90% of crime, of guns that are found at the scene or guns used in crimes were not purchased by the person who actually used them. In other words, the person using the gun more than likely did not obtain the firearm legally. In other words, it's not their gun. I remember there was an old comedy routine with Cat Williams. And he was talking about why am I going to go commit a crime with a gun that can be traced back to me? Yeah, that was, I mean, it only makes sense. And it was funny. As a matter of fact, I just did an interview with the California Health Report where I noted that. We already know this. Criminals are not going to follow the law, who are going to use a gun to commit a crime are not going to follow the law. In other words, if they're going to go break the law, they're not going to follow the law in obtaining a firearm that they're going to use to break the law. That's just idiotic, in particular, to expect that they would do that. And oh, by the way, let's talk about whether or not they work. Because one of the things they want to do is they want to prevent mass shootings, right? But how many mass shootings have taken place where people actually
passed a background check. Well, let's just take a look. In 2018 alone, you had the mass murder who killed 12 people in Thousand Oaks at the Borderline bar. You had the mass murder who killed 11 people in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in a synagogue. He passed a background check. You had the mass murderer who killed 4 people in Annapolis, Maryland, in a newspaper office. Once again, passed a background check. The student who killed 10 people in El Paso, Texas. He actually stole the guns. So guess what? There was no background check. There was a schizophrenic who murdered 4 people at a Waffle House restaurant in Nashville, Tennessee. He was disarmed after he made threats. In a federal lawsuit, the murderer's father said he was never told his son was a prohibited person, right, and not allowed to have guns. So no one told anyone else that this person was prohibited. The point that I'm making, then there's Mr. Cruz, who once again passed a background check. I guess the point that I'm making here is this: is that if you look at all of these shootings that took place, there's the Las Vegas shooter. Once again, these are folks who, once again, despite the fact that there were background checks, some of these are folks who actually went through background checks. And guess what? They still were able to commit mass shootings. That's because, contrary to what Mr. Murphy would have us to believe, no, background checks do not work. Let's move on to the next one.
But a lot has changed in the last 25 years, and our gun laws haven't kept up. The Brady bill only requires background checks by licensed gun dealers, not private sellers who push guns online or at gun shows. People who shouldn't be able to buy a gun are taking advantage of these loopholes. Gangs smuggling guns into Central America just buy their guns at gun shows.
Okay, so first of all, the last one, when we talk about them smuggling guns into Central America, well, okay, that's really doesn't have much to do with American gun violence, but that aside, okay, ATF just released a report basically noting that almost no guns used in crimes were actually purchased legally. Were actually purchased through a gun dealer or at a gun show. They were almost always obtained illegally. So I don't get what it is, this idea of quote-unquote loopholes that no one is using, right? These are not loopholes that people are using because, once again, people don't want, people are finding ways, they're buying the guns illegally, period. In particular, because these guns that are used in crimes, they're able to buy cheaper than they are if they go through a registered dealer, or they go through the background check process. It is just idiotic to think that, well, hey, I mean, you call it a loophole, but studies don't bear out. Studies don't support the idea that, they don't support the argument that you're making, Mr. Murphy, on that particular topic.
A recent study from Harvard showed that as many as a quarter of all guns transferred from one person to another happen without a background check, often by people knowing that they can't pass one.
You notice there's a little interesting thing that they missed there, and that they kind of noted. You notice that they said almost a quarter of all gun sales. Well, that means that 75% of all firearm sales, legal firearm sales, go through a background check. 75%. Now, what percentage of all of those firearms actually wind up being used in crimes? Once again, in either case, a very small percentage of those firearms actually wind up being used in crimes. So I don't know where he's in particular where he's going with that one. So anyway, he's introduced a law that will require background checks on all sales, private or on gun shows. It'll require background checks for them all at the federal level. And he happens to think that this particular measure it'll make a difference.
And if we pass this bill, we're going to save thousands of lives. Why? Because the data tells us that background checks work better than almost any other gun safety law.
Okay, so I want you to catch that now. He didn't say that they work. If he had said that they work and stop, well, that would have been a lie. But he said that they work better than almost any other law, but better than almost any other gun safety law, right? But what he doesn't tell you is it's already been determined that, well, background checks, in fact, do not work, right? Even the anti-gun gun violence research center at the University of California at Davis, even the guy who runs that says it doesn't work. He says there's evidence. This is Garen Wintemute. You guys have heard me talk about this guy before. There's been evidence that background checks, while effective on the individual level, are not as effective at the population level as we would like them to be, Wintemute said. We've wondered if one of the reasons for this is people simply are not getting background checks. That's part of the situation. So in other words, what's happening is people are just choosing not to get them. They're just going and they're just doing the firearms. In other words, people who don't want background checks, they're going to go around the law. They're just going to go ahead and get the gun, and they're not going to get a background check. Now, that means that they're probably not going to legally transfer that firearm. Hello? That's the point, is that it's already been deemed that guns used in crimes are not purchased legally. So therefore, they don't go through background checks. Even a lot of people who do purchase guns are not doing it because guess what? They don't want to go through a background. If someone doesn't want to go through a background check, they're not going to go through a background check. If someone is going to use their firearm to commit a crime, they're not going to go through a background check. If someone's afraid that they're going to fail a background check, they're not going to go get a background check. The thing is, and this goes back to everything that we've always talked about, laws apply to the law-abiding. And to expect someone who's about to commit a crime, someone who's already in a process where they're going to break the law, to expect that they're going to go and then, follow the law, is really just kind of stupid. Then again, most gun control laws are. Anyway, folks, that's going to be it for today's Coffee with Craig. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for being a part of the fight for our right to keep and bear arms. We absolutely positively cannot do it without you. So, with all of that having been said, please remember to tell your friends about the Firearms Policy Coalition. We are the home in the fight for civil rights. Gotta use them or you're going to lose them. You guys take care.
If you like our videos, follow, subscribe, like, and share.